We're continuing our partnership with the good people over at Learn Liberty today, and joining me is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Tampa and an affiliated scholar with both the Mercatus Center and the Foundation for Economic Education. Dr. Abby Hall, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thank you for having me.
How was my intro there? I felt good about that.
Good.
Worked?
I liked it.
All right. There's a lot I want to get into with you because I was looking at your bio, and a lot of the stuff that you talk about, that you specialize in, is stuff that I really like that we haven't done a ton on. So can we jump into foreign policy first?
Sure.
Foreign policy, to me, seems like one of the craziest things that we have going on these days because everyone's talking about it, and yet it seems like no one knows what they're talking about. Is that a generally fair statement to start us off on here? That just everyone's always talking about all this stuff and nobody really knows what's going on. Not nobody, but the masses.
If it's comforting at all, having a lot of foreign policy issues that people know nothing about is not anything that is new to today. However, I would say that foreign policy is an area where a lot of people are, I think, rationally fairly ignorant. Just because a lot of foreign policy, people think, I think often incorrectly, that foreign policy doesn't have any kind of impact on what's going on domestically. Yeah.
So I like that you set it up that way, that it's not necessarily any worse now. I think it seems like it's somehow worse now because of social media. So you just see people all day long who you know don't really know what they're saying, and they're constantly saying things. But as someone that knows a bit about foreign policy, what are some of the tenets you need in a solid, sound foreign policy?
It's a complicated question.
Well, that's why you're here.
It is.
Let's do it.
I don't pretend to be able to sit from my position and prescribe foreign policy. That is not what I see my role as an economist as being. But I can say that economics gives us a lot of insights as to how we should expect foreign policy to work, or in a lot of cases to not work in the way that it's intended. Whether we're talking about humanitarian interventions or if we're talking about military interventions, economics and the frameworks that are given to us so that we can talk about from an economic perspective are helpful in understanding what's going on with a lot of foreign policy.
Yeah, how much of our foreign policy is directly economically based? Like, we like to think, oh, we do this for humanitarian reasons, or we do this because of some other reason. But is it, at the end of the day, is it like 90% that's really just about economics? It's
hard to prescribe something as being just economic. As I try to pitch my students when they're in class, everything is an economics problem if you look at it hard enough.
Says the economics professor.
Of course. Yeah. But if you look at foreign intervention, there is absolutely what we would call the public choice aspect of foreign policy, what Dwight Eisenhower referred to as the military-industrial complex. So you have congressional leaders, you have the Pentagon, you have private interest, who all have a vested interest in engaging in foreign policy, or particular types of foreign policy, I should say, regardless of whether or not it's actually productive or serving the quote-unquote common good.
Yeah, when you say particular types, you're talking about some sort of military intervention, basically.
Military intervention, although one thing that we have observed for the last several decades, humanitarian interventions are becoming more and more something that's falling under the umbrella of military execution, regardless of whether or not that's appropriate.
Yeah. So when you see something like Syria going on right now and there's a humanitarian disaster, are they bringing in economists to say, guys, there's a humanitarian disaster, there's people, hundreds of thousands, something like 500,000 people have died over the last 8 years or something like that. Like, what are the economic choices we have to make this viable? Or is it just that the machine just kind of exists and they're just going to make the decisions and do what they want?
I can't say that I know exactly what the Obama administration, what now the Trump administration are doing as far as consulting economists about what to do in Syria. Unfortunately, and this has been point of a lot of the research that I've done, is people tend to think about foreign intervention as being something really simple. It's a math problem, or very just linear of, here's a problem, we want to get from this point to that point, and here's a solution that's supposed to fix it. So we go from A to B to C. Unfortunately, that is not how things work.
Yeah, has it ever worked that way?
No.
Has there ever been the A to B to C? Never, right?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Things are not linear like that. And so when you think about issues, especially something that's as complex as foreign policy, where you are dealing with millions of actors and parts of, an economy, social issues, political issues, all of those things are coming together and they're working or not working. But when you intervene in one place in that system, it's totally just fantastic thinking to look at that and go, sure, if we intervene at one part in the system, there's no way that there's going to be an impact in other parts of that system as well. And that's where you wind up running into some really nefarious, unintended consequences, which we have seen over and over and over again.
Right. Is this also sort of the idea of like mission creep, where they always sort of have one goal and then it keeps becoming another goal and another goal and another goal, and then you don't even know where you started at the beginning?
Maybe part of that. So when we talk about mission creep, that's certainly part of the economics of bureaucracy. And one thing about foreign intervention of really any flavor, whether we're talking about humanitarian aid or we're talking about war, it's all done in this bureaucratic regime, so overlapping layers of bureaucracy. Bureaucratic firms don't compete for profit like a standard firm would. So the way I typically explain it, if you have a for-profit firm, they look at their financial statements at the end of the quarter, they're earning a profit. That's indicating to them that they are providing something that is adding value to society. A negative profit or a loss indicates the opposite. Bureaucracies, however, they're not competing for profit or loss. They are competing for government resources, so pieces of some larger budget. How do they convey that they should get a bigger piece of that budget, that they should have more personnel? By taking on more and more activities which are important to the powers that be.
Yeah, so just to be clear, they're competing for this budget, so they have to spend money even in cases where they wouldn't have a good reason to. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. There's no incentive to cost minimize.
Right.
If you are...
There's a decentive, right? I mean, there's reasons not to do it.
Oh, and
because
absolutely.
then your budget will be cut.
Right.
Yeah.
If I'm a government agency and I go to you as the federal government and I say, hey, I can do the exact same job that I'm doing with 20% less money, the next year I'm going to have 20% less in my budget, which is not what you're incentivized to do. As somebody operating a bureaucracy. Now, this doesn't mean that the people who are working in the government are necessarily, terrible people who are sitting there wringing their hands trying to get as much money as possible. But as an economist, we look at that and we say, well, this is the incentive structure that they face.
So how did that system get built? I mean, how did this come to be? I'm not an economist, but it sounds quite ridiculous. I would want something that was slim and trim and took as little from the people as possible, and that could, every year become more efficient and need less resources and all that. And that's quite literally the reverse of what we have.
One thing about this bureaucratic system is that there is that incentive to expand. Not saying that it's not possible to constrain it, but there's actually an entire branch of economics called constitutional political economy, which is trying to answer the question of, if we want something like a government who will provide quote unquote national defense or roads or education, whatever you want to put in that bucket, how do we construct a political system where we can empower our leaders to do the things that we want them to do, and yet simultaneously constrain them to not go outside of those stated confines that we would prefer, or those functions that we want them to fulfill. In terms of how we got there, it's a tricky question. It requires a lot of historical knowledge. My experience has been looking at how things have evolved militarily, particularly that military-industrial complex, because we've always seen a relationship between private actors and public actors. That's nothing that's new. However, this massive kind of military spending that we have right now is not something that has always been observed in the US. And that really starts, I think, if you want to pinpoint it, during the interwar years between World War I and World War II, because you've got contracting rules that change. So it used to be if I had an idea for something that the military could use, I would pitch that idea to various boards. They would look at it. They would look to see if it was a good idea. They'd send out bids. But now, and this kind of started during that period, the rules of the game have changed for those kinds of contracts. So instead of who can build something the cheapest, it might be, oh, we have a relationship with this particular company, or they're familiar with our processes. And so it's built up over time.
Do you think there's any kind of functional way to roll back some of that? I mean, if you wanted to get the system, if you wanted to have a fair bidding process or something that was going to be a little more fiscally responsible or any of that, is it possible to roll back things that are inside of such a massive complex as you're mentioning?
I would like to say that I think anything is possible. I'm not sure that I think it's particularly likely.
Yeah.
You have massive entrenched interest. You look at something like drones or tanks. There have been tanks, for example, that the military has said for years, we do not want them.
Yeah.
And yet they continue to be manufactured, and they are quite literally sitting in a compound somewhere, and they are just rusting.
Yeah.
Why are we still manufacturing these? It's because the places where they're manufactured, they're elected officials, keenly aware of the fact that if they shut down these factories, some of their constituency is going to be unemployed. That does not bode well for their reelection.
Yeah.
They fight really hard to keep those things in place. And so you're fighting those battles at so many different junctures. I'm honestly not really sure what it would take.
Yeah. How could you even start to fight that at the political level? Because you'd have to have a politician who'd be willing to say to his own people, you're going to lose some jobs because unfortunately in this case, it's the right thing to do.
Right. And we
don't get many politicians like that, do we?
No. And there's actually a famous economist named F.A. Hayek, who in chapter 10 of his book, The Road to Serfdom, talks about why the worst get on top. So why it is that you are unlikely to have those kinds of political officials get into place. Because the people who are going to seek out those positions and people who are going to, importantly, be successful in those positions are not to the people who are going to say, let's take one for the team and roll back these policies. People like to think, and economists make this mistake as well, that political officials are publicly interested. So they set aside their own incentives, their own desires, and instead they're trying to fulfill some broader notion of the public good. So they've set it up oftentimes what's called a social welfare function. So you put societal welfare on one side of the equal sign, and if you just have all of your math correct on the other side, you can make people as happy as possible. But this really ignores things that you learn on quite literally day one of your economics classes.
Right.
That people respond to incentives. So political actors, just like any other actor facing scarcity, we should expect that they're going to respond to incentives as well.
Yeah. Is there any sensible way to disconnect the politics from the way that the military is run and funded? Again, I mean, it's sort of the same question that I'm asking you before, but is there some possible way that we could have some sort of go-between between those two things so that they could run more efficiently?
It's tricky because oftentimes when people look, and even people who acknowledge that maybe there is an issue with military spending or the U.S. is too involved militarily, which can get you in hot water very, very quickly, because military is one of the sacred cows in the United States. People will suggest doing different kinds of things. Well, maybe you should limit lobbying or campaign contributions or something like that. But again, we go back to one of the first things that we learn in economics, which is that when you have scarcity, so when people are competing for resources, that competition is ever present. Whether you are competing in the marketplace for profit, if you are in a bureaucracy and you are competing for pieces of government budget, just because you change the system, not going to change the fact that there's competition there. But so that entire field looking at how do we devise rules.
Right. This is kind of a funny place for an economist to be because you're dealing in a system that doesn't deal with the normal rules of an economy.
So, I mean, it is and it isn't. Like I can see, because oftentimes when people look at economists, they think that we are exclusively looking at how markets operate. But economics is much more fundamentally about human interaction. So given the fact that resources are scarce and people respond to incentives, how is it that people coordinate and exchange with each other? And in that case then, economics is much more broad in terms of the scale and the scope of what it is that economics can talk about.